This presentation is brought to you by Arizona State University's Julianne Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability and a generous investment by Julianne Wrigley.
So what's the most important thing that we can do about a changing climate? Well, it might be a bit counterintuitive, but I truly believe it's talking about it. So this is what I talked about in my TED Talk. Now, when they asked me to do my TED Talk, I said, well, I want to talk about what we can do about climate change, because you've already had like the climate modeling talk, you've already had the talk about clouds, you've already had a lot of talks by a lot of other scientists, so I want to talk about what we can do about it. And they're like, we already have TED Talks about light bulbs and recycling. I was like, no, I don't want to talk about that. And they're like, electric cars? No, I don't want to talk about that either. I want to talk about the fact that when you survey people across the country and you ask them, do you think global warming is real? Do you think it affects plants and animals? Do you think it affects future generations? Most people say yes. And then you say, do you think it affects people in developing countries, people who live in the US? Most people say, yeah, pretty much yes. And you even ask people, do you think humans are causing it? And actually the majority of people still say yes. And then you ask people, do you think it will affect you? And all of a sudden the answer is no. And then you say, do you ever talk about it? And the answer is just, nobody ever talks about it. And if you don't talk about it, why would you care? And if you don't care, why would you ever act? So what can we talk about? How can we have conversations about a changing climate that are relevant to people's lives, that are current, because there's so much looking for our attention today, that are constructive, that actually take us to a better place, and most of all, that are hopeful, instead of leaving us paralyzed with fear? How can we have those conversations? Well, let me just put an asterisk on that for just a second. This is the 6 Americas of global warming. It's a really useful tool that shows where people fall on the spectrum of how concerned they are about the impacts of a changing climate and how much they support climate action. We often feel as if it's either yes or no, and we feel as if the yeses and the nos are the same size, or maybe the nos are even bigger. That's not the case. People who are truly dismissive, and my definition of dismissive is if an angel from God with brand new tablets of stone appeared before them, and they said global warming is real in foot-high letters of flame, they would still dismiss it. So who am I to think I could change their minds? People who are truly dismissive are only 9% of the population, yet they represent 90% of the online dialogue about climate change. So do not be deceived. There is no point talking to or reasoning with the 9%, because to them, changing their mind about a changing climate is asking them to change a part of their identity that is so profoundly part of them that it's almost like asking them to amputate a body part. I am not exaggerating. So with a dismissive person, a person whose ears and eyes are closed to anything they see or anything you say, there is no constructive conversation. But the good news is 91% of us aren't. And there we absolutely can have positive, constructive conversations. Not conversations where Susie the scientist shows up with her million scientific reports, and Calvin, because he feels his identity is being threatened, Calvin responds something like this. How arrogant of you to say that I don't know. Let me school you. This was actually a real message I got from a student at Texas Tech. Don't worry, it's nobody you know. These types of conversations dig a trench. They don't build a bridge, and they tend to end something like this. So if we're not having a conversation with somebody who's dismissive, and we're not showing up with our pile of scientific reports to, up to the roof, then we can have a constructive conversation. And that constructive conversation begins not with what we disagree about, but what we agree about. We have to begin the conversation with something we agree about. And if you don't know what you agree with somebody about, talk to them and ask them questions and get to know them. And if you don't find something that you can agree on, then you're not the right person to have that conversation with them. If you cannot begin a conversation with something that you truly, genuinely agree with that person on, then it's not going to be a constructive conversation.
This presentation is brought to you by Arizona State University's Julianne Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability for educational and non-commercial use only.